Ethan had just finished moving the last box into his new house when he noticed her. Standing at the edge of his driveway was a short, stiff-backed woman with her arms crossed and a look of unmistakable disdain on her face. Her lips were curled in a sneer, and her eyes darted from his car to his clothes, then finally to his face. She made no attempt to hide her scrutiny. "Can I help you?" Ethan asked, already sensing the kind of interaction this was going to be. The woman didn't introduce herself. Instead, she gestured vaguely at his house. "You live here now?" Ethan wiped the sweat from his brow, still holding a box of books. "Yeah, just moved in." The woman let out a slow, exaggerated sigh, as if she had just received the worst possible news. "Well," she said, her voice dripping with disapproval, "I hope you keep the place presentable. Our HOA has very high standards." Ethan had met people like her before, self-important, entitled, and far too interested in controlling the world around them. He simply nodded and walked inside, deciding it wasn't worth engaging further. But the woman, whose name he would later learn was Margaret, wasn't the type to let things go. Chapter 2. The complaints begin. By the end of his first week in the neighborhood, Ethan had already received 2 formal complaints from the HOA, both signed by Margaret. The first accused him of leaving his trash cans out too long, despite the fact that every other house on the street had theirs in the exact same spot. The second claimed that his grass was too long, even though Ethan had mowed it just 2 days prior. It was clear that Margaret was testing him, seeing how much of a nuisance she could be before he either snapped or packed up and left. When the HOA violations failed to rattle him, she escalated. She started calling the police. At first, it was minor things, claims of excessive noise, even though Ethan rarely played music and barely had any visitors. Then it became more ridiculous. She called to report that he was acting suspiciously in his own front yard. Another time, she claimed he was running an unregistered business out of his garage. Each time, the officers showed up, checked the situation, and left after finding nothing wrong. Eventually, they stopped taking her calls seriously. But Margaret wasn't the type to accept defeat. If the real police wouldn't handle her problem, then she would find another way. Chapter 3. The Plan. Margaret sat in her pristine, over-decorated living room, tapping her nails against the armrest of her couch. The police had failed her. No matter how many times she called, no matter how many false reports she filed, they refused to do their jobs. That arrogant man was still there, still mowing his lawn, still parking his car in the driveway, still acting like he belonged in her neighborhood. It was unacceptable. She needed someone who would actually do something. Her eyes drifted toward the basement door. Her 32-year-old son, Daniel, had lived in that basement for the past decade, jobless, bitter, and convinced that the world owed him something. He had always dreamed of becoming a police officer, convinced it was his destiny. But reality had other plans. He had failed the entrance exam twice and flunked out of the police academy after barely making it in. "It wasn't my fault," he insisted. "The department just doesn't respect strong, dominant men like me." Margaret indulged his delusions. She even bought him a second-hand security guard uniform after he claimed he would start his own private law enforcement business. That never happened, but Daniel still strutted around the house in the uniform, practicing his cop voice and spinning a fake badge he had ordered online between his fingers. Margaret pushed open the basement door and called his name. A few minutes later, Daniel emerged, wearing a stretched-out tank top and basketball shorts, his hair a greasy mess. He plopped onto the couch, scratching his belly. "What?" he grumbled. Margaret pursed her lips. "We need to talk about our problem next door." Daniel groaned. "You're still on that?" "Yes," she snapped, "and I need your help. The police won't do their jobs, so we're going to handle it ourselves." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "How?" Margaret leaned in, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "You've always wanted to be a cop, right? Well, now's your chance to act like one." It took a second for the idea to settle in Daniel's mind, but once it did, his lips curled into a slow, smug grin. "You mean, like, arrest him?" "Exactly." Daniel laughed, shaking his head. "Mom, I don't think you realize how genius this is. If he thinks the police are coming for him, he'll have to leave." Margaret beamed. "That's the spirit." For the first time in months, Daniel had a purpose. He rushed to his room and pulled out his prized possessions. His fake badge, the cheap polyester security uniform, and a plastic holster with no actual weapon inside. He adjusted his belt in the mirror, puffed out his chest, and practiced his best authoritative glare. Margaret clapped her hands together, giddy with excitement. Tomorrow night, we make our move. Daniel smirked. Time to show that guy what real law enforcement looks like. Neither of them had any idea just how badly this plan was going to backfire. Chapter 4. The Confrontation. The evening air was still and quiet when the pounding came at Ethan's front door. Bang. 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 Open up. This is the police. Daniel's voice was deep, trying too hard to sound authoritative. Ethan, who had been watching a basketball game, sighed and muted the TV. He had been expecting Margaret to try something ridiculous, but this was a new level of desperation. He opened the door to find Daniel standing there in an ill-fitting security uniform, a fake badge clipped to his belt, and an empty holster strapped around his waist. His stance was wide, chest puffed out like a bad action movie character. Behind him, Margaret stood with her arms crossed, her smug expression practically radiating satisfaction. Daniel held up a crumpled piece of paper. You're under arrest. Warrant for your detainment. Ethan raised an eyebrow. A warrant for what exactly? Daniel hesitated for a split second before blurting, illegal activity. Ethan had to fight the urge to laugh. He leaned against the door frame, casually crossing his arms. Illegal activity? That's real specific. Daniel scowled. Step outside, sir. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. Margaret finally spoke up, her voice dripping with condescension. Oh, don't bother arguing, Ethan. You've been causing problems since the day you moved in. I knew this day would come. Ethan exhaled slowly, tilting his head as he studied Daniel's outfit. The badge was cheap and slightly crooked. His uniform had no patches, no department name, and was clearly store-bought. The holster was empty. It was embarrassing. So, you're a cop, huh? Ethan asked, playing along. Daniel straightened up. That's right. Which department? Daniel blinked. The local one. The local what? Daniel's face twitched. Police department. Obviously. Ethan chuckled. Right. And what's your badge number? Daniel hesitated, his eyes darting toward Margaret, who was now shifting uncomfortably. Ethan took a step forward. Go ahead. Recite it. Daniel stammered. I don't have to tell you that. Oh, but you do. Ethan's voice hardened just a bit, though his expression remained calm. Because if you're really an officer, you know that's standard procedure. So, I'll ask again, what's your badge number? Daniel swallowed hard. Listen, man, you're making this way more difficult than it needs to be. Ethan smirked. Am I? The confidence in Daniel's eyes flickered. He was beginning to realize just how badly this was going. Margaret, too, was shifting from smug satisfaction to growing unease. And then, before either of them could react, Ethan reached into his pocket. What he pulled out made both Daniel and Margaret go pale. Ethan held up a real police badge, a gleaming, official one, the kind that didn't come from a shady online store, the kind that carried actual authority. Daniel's eyes widened as he stepped back instinctively. What is that? Ethan flipped the badge open, revealing his credentials. It's called a real police badge. You know, the kind given to actual law enforcement officers. Margaret's mouth fell open. That can't be real. Oh, it's real, Ethan said, stepping forward, his calm demeanor now carrying an unmistakable air of command. And you know what else is real? The crime you just committed. Daniel stammered. Crime? We were just trying to. Impersonating an officer, Ethan interrupted. That's a felony. Attempted unlawful detainment, also illegal. You knocked on my door, pretending to be law enforcement, tried to serve a fake warrant, and attempted to intimidate me into complying. He shook his head. You just dug yourself a deep hole, Daniel. Daniel was sweating now, his hands twitching at his sides. Wait. We can talk about this, man. Oh, we will, Ethan said, but not out here. Margaret, still struggling to process the situation, suddenly snapped back to life. Now, hold on. You can't do this. He's my son. He was just trying to help. Ethan turned toward her. Margaret, your son just tried to arrest a man on his own property with no real authority. That's not helping. That's a crime. And you encouraged him. Margaret's face turned red. I was only trying to protect the neighborhood. From what exactly? Ethan asked, raising an eyebrow. Margaret's mouth opened, but no words came out. That was all the confirmation Ethan needed. He pulled out his phone. I could call one of my officers to come pick you both up, but honestly, I think I'd rather handle this myself. Daniel was shaking his head, hands raised slightly. Come on, man, please. I didn't mean. Oh, you meant every word, Ethan said. And now you're going to face the consequences. He pulled out his handcuffs. Daniel let out a choke noise. Margaret gasped. And in that moment, both of them realized this wasn't just some neighborhood dispute anymore. They had just messed with the wrong man. Chapter 5, The Fallout. For the first time that night, Margaret looked genuinely scared. Her usual smugness had disappeared as she watched Ethan pull out his phone and dial. Yeah, I've got an active case of police impersonation, he said casually into the receiver. Attempted unlawful detainment. Send a unit to my address. Margaret's face twisted with panic. Now hold on just a second. You can't do this. Ethan glanced at her. Oh, but I can. Daniel, meanwhile, was trembling. His tough guy act had fully crumbled. Look, man, we can talk this out, right? No need to involve. The distant wail of sirens cut through the night air. Daniel's entire body jerked at the sound. No, no, no. Then, in a flash of desperation, he did something incredibly stupid. He ran. Spinning on his heel, Daniel took off down the driveway like a startled deer, arms pumping wildly. Unfortunately for him, running in loose dress shoes wasn't exactly ideal. His foot caught the edge of the curb, sending him sprawling forward. He barely had time to get back up before the real officers arrived. 3 squad cars rolled in, blue and red lights flashing as officers stepped out, weapons drawn. Freeze. Hands where we can see them. Daniel, winded and desperate, threw his hands up immediately. I was just. One officer swiftly tackled him to the ground, pinning his arms behind his back as he let out a pathetic yelp. Margaret screamed, Stop. Stop. He's just a boy. Ethan turned to her with a smirk. Oh, I thought he was a police officer. Margaret's eyes darted around wildly. This is ridiculous. I was only trying to protect my neighborhood. He didn't mean anything by it. One of the officers approached her. Ma'am, we've reviewed your call history with dispatch. You've made multiple false police reports regarding your neighbor. Margaret scoffed. So what? I was concerned. The officer pulled out a pair of handcuffs. You lied to emergency services, attempted to have an innocent man removed from his home, and encouraged your son to impersonate an officer. That's conspiracy. Margaret took a step back, shaking her head. No, no, you can't arrest me. Aye. The handcuffs snapped onto her wrists. Ethan exhaled, shaking his head as Margaret and Daniel were both hauled to their feet. Daniel, looking close to tears, muttered, This is so unfair. Ethan chuckled. Tell that to the judge. And with that, the officers led them away. Chapter 6, The Aftermath. By the time the police cars pulled away, the entire neighborhood was awake. Windows were lit, curtains were pulled back, and a few curious residents had even stepped outside, whispering amongst themselves. Did you see that? One woman murmured. She really sent her own son to pretend to be a cop. Another man shook his head in disbelief. I knew she was crazy, but this. Ethan took a deep breath, glancing around. He had lived here for a while, but most of these people had barely spoken to him. Now, though, their eyes weren't full of suspicion or annoyance. They were full of respect. Margaret, the woman who had spent months trying to get him out of the neighborhood, was gone. And Ethan, he wasn't going anywhere. Chapter 7, Justice Served. The next morning, things got even better. The HOA board, who had always turned a blind eye to Margaret's antics, suddenly released an official statement. We do not condone the actions of former HOA member Margaret Williams, it read. As of today, she has been permanently removed from our association, and any remaining influence she had over the community has been revoked. Ethan smirked as he read the letter. For months, Margaret had made his life hell, convinced that she could bully him into leaving. Now, she had lost everything. Her precious HOA status, her credibility, and most importantly, her freedom. Later that day, Ethan stepped outside to grab his mail. A few of his neighbors stood nearby, awkwardly watching him. Finally, one of them, a middle-aged man, cleared his throat. Hey, sorry about all that, he said. Ethan simply smiled. No worries. Justice has a funny way of working itself out. And with that, he walked back into his home, completely at peace.